Are you managing a diverse team, or you're wondering how you can better manage a diverse workforce? In this video, that's exactly what we're going to talk about. I have 5 tips to help you out when it comes to managing and finding and creating a better and more diverse team. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Preston, author of Harness Your Butterflies and creator of the Career Accelerator program aimed at helping you accelerate your career and live the life that you've always wanted to live. If you're new to the channel, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and leave me a thumbs up for the YouTube algorithm, and let's jump into talking about how do you manage and create a diverse team. Let's go. Okay, so this is potentially a controversial topic depending on what your organization deems as diversity. And a lot of organizations will like to say that diversity is something that every team should have, but they oftentimes miss some of the layers of diversity, and they only kind of look at the surface level of what really makes a team diverse and really what makes a team successful. The reason that you want to make a diverse team or have a diverse team, and the reason that you want to be able to manage that diverse team, is because diverse teams bring a different sense of perspective and ideas to the table, and in the long term, diverse teams actually prove to be more successful and come up with more innovative and creative ideas that solve a lot more problems than teams that are more homogeneous, is what they're called. So when we're talking about diverse teams, we're talking about incorporating different layers of diversity so that your teams are not homogeneous. So let's jump into the tips. The first tip is define diversity. Oftentimes organizations, when they talk about diversity, they're talking about your ethnicity, your race, or your background, or they're trying to talk about your sexual orientation or your gender. They like to put kind of surface level labels on diversity in a way that kind of categorizes people into these larger buckets. But you can be from the same ethnicity and have different experiences, or you can have the same sexual orientation as one of your coworkers and still have a very different experience from that coworker. So when we're defining diversity, we want to take into account those layers of ethnicity and sexual orientation and gender, because those sculpt your experience, but you also want to look at other things like people's psychological behaviors, like their strengths. What are their strengths? Sometimes leaders like to stack their teams with similar strength people. So they might have a diverse group of people that maybe are from different regions, have different sexual orientations, are different genders, or non-binary. They have kind of those check marks, but all of those team members are relationship oriented people as opposed to execution people or strategic people or influencing people. And so when we're talking about diversity, you kind of have to look at it at a broader spectrum of what makes someone unique. What are the things that when you're looking in a professional environment, what makes up diversity? Now, this is going to be different for every organization, because the way that you look at diversity is kind of from the stance of where you are right now. So if you are, let's say, and I'm just making this up, if you are a predominantly white organization, diversity for you might look like adding more different ethnicity or sexual orientation or genders like we talked about before. But for me, for example, I work for an organization that is primarily Native American, or I did work for an organization that was primarily Native American owned. So most of the employees that I worked with were all Native Americans. Now, diversity for that organization might look like something like different varying levels of education. So you might have master's degrees, you might have bachelor's degrees or associate's degrees, but diversity for that organization might be what tribe are you from? Or what other professional organizations do you belong to? Which school did you go to? Which region do you come from? So it's a lot more complex than just saying we want a diverse team made up of 4 or 5 different ethnicities, because that's not always going to solve the problem of creating a diverse workforce. So that's step 1, is defining what diversity looks like for your organization, and think more broadly, incorporate those other layers that I talked about, but then also consider things like what's your level of education, what industries are you working at, what industries are you coming from, what type of managerial experience do you have? So there's different layers of diversity or perspectives that you want to make sure that you include on your team. Number 2, the second tip for creating and managing a diverse workforce is utilizing an ERG or a BRG. If you haven't heard of an ERG, an employee resource group, or a BRG, business resource group, they've been kind of interchangeable depending on the organization. Let me take a step back. ERGs, employee resource groups, are pretty common among larger organizations. The definition of ERG is a group of employees that have come together for one common cause to be able to move the organization ahead in that particular sector. So just as an example, an organization I used to work at had multiple ERGs. One of them was an LGBT group. One of them was a Black women in business. One of them was a Black men in business. There was another one that was another group of working mothers. And what those groups did was, it was a group of people who belonged to that community or were allies of that community who wanted to advocate and make better the situation that they had in the workforce to be able to kind of move those groups ahead. An example of what that looks like, real quickly before I jump into the tip, an ERG, let's say for pregnant women, might be advocating to the organization to be able to have longer maternity leave for the employees that have babies, or have a more flexible schedule if a mother needs to go pick up her kid from school or things like that. So that's just an example of how an ERG works. So then let's talk about how to tap into an ERG to help your team become more diverse. So there's two ways that you can do this. The first way that you can tap into an ERG is actually encouraging your employees to be a part of an ERG and participate in that specific group. Now, as a manager, you are responsible for making sure that your work and your team's work and your department, that all of the stuff that you are assigned is getting done. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you're prioritizing retention among your team. And what that means is, if you can actually encourage your team to participate in some of these extracurricular things outside of the workforce that are common to their interests, you don't want to force them and say you need to be part of the Black men in business, because if they're not a Black man in business, that might not be something they're interested in. But if that's something where you can naturally align one of your employees with an ERG, that's a really great way for them to experience other similar people in the organization and be able to create a network that will, in the long term, help your department, because your department then becomes in touch with other aspects of the business. So that's the first way, is encouraging your team to be a part of these ERGs and expand their networks internally so that they become more valuable to the organization, but in turn, they're making your team and your department more valuable to the organization. The second way that you can utilize an ERG is by asking them, if you've noticed that there's a gap in your team, or there's some part of your team that is needing some sort of jolt of creativity or perspective. Let's say you're working on a project, you might want to pull on one of the employee ERGs to collaborate with your work and see what's happening. So for example, if you're in marketing and you're putting together a campaign, let's say that you want to do something for Pride Month, which is in June, and your team, let's say, doesn't have any members of the LGBT community, that's okay. But in order to kind of get that diverse perspective, you can actually reach out to that ERG, the LGBT ERG, and say, hey, we would like to tap into the employee resource group and use your guys' perspective to kind of help us shape the message, sculpt kind of who are we going to reach out to, who are the influencers in the space, what's the messaging, all of those things. And not to say that this is going to apply for every department, but even a basic thing like scheduling a training or some sort of session. If you're leading the finance group and you really don't have any collaborative things to talk about with the LGBT community, you can still bring them in, let's say during Pride Month, and say, hey, can you guys do a presentation to us talking about what's happened in the community in the past year? And then that way you're brought up to speed with what's happening in that community, and your team gets a broader perspective of what's happening around the world. Two kind of cool ways to utilize an employee resource group. If you have any other recommendations about how you can tap into an ERG, or if you're really interested in learning more about employee resource groups, let me know in the comment below. I can always make another video about it. But I'm interested to hear any other things that you want to tap into when working with an ERG. The third tip for managing and creating a diverse workforce is focusing on diversity in your hiring process. Now, what that looks like is, you don't want to necessarily blanket statement and say, I want someone with this ethnicity, this sexual orientation, this gender, etc. What I'm saying is, if you look at your team, and if you, let's say, have hired 2 or 3 people, you'll start to notice your own hiring bias, and every organization has it. Even if you try to avoid it, you'll probably still find some commonalities of the people that you're hiring based on their personalities, based on their strengths. You'll kind of see some trends in terms of, organizations hiring for culture fit, when really they just say they want the same type of person no matter what your background is. They just want, somebody who fits their mold to kind of interact with their employees. So if you look at diversity from the hiring perspective, your responsibility as a manager is to make sure that you are presenting a team that's able to be agile and flexible enough to meet the needs of the market of today and the market of the future. And so when you're looking at hiring new employees, you want to make sure that you're hiring not only for talent and performance, and you're making sure that you're hiring the right person regardless of their ethnicity. So you don't want to just say, oh, we need an extra white person, let's hire a white person. You want to make sure that you're hiring the right person, but assuming that though you have a diverse range of candidates that fit what you're looking for, you want to make sure that you're looking at their strengths, which I'll talk about in a second. You also want to make sure that you're looking at how are they going to fit into your team and how are they going to be able to add perspective into what you're working on. So let's say you're interviewing a candidate, asking them questions that kind of gets to the bottom of how are they problem solving, how are they coming up with a solution to a problem, and seeing if that's a different skill set or a different way of thinking than what you already have on your team. What you'll find is when you start to incorporate other diverse perspectives into your hiring process, you'll start to see that once you get those people onboarded, they're going to be adding a lot of value and asking questions that nobody on your team has asked before. For example, if you hire someone that is a very strategic level thinker, and right now your team has a lot of, let's say, execution-minded people, that strategy person is going to come in and start asking questions about how things connect, not because they think that it's wrong, because they're trying to understand and they're trying to wrap their head around it. That level of thinking will elevate your department and your processes so that everyone now is thinking at a different level because they're incorporating this new perspective and having to articulate why things are the way they are. So by incorporating some level of diversity into your hiring process and trying to find candidates who will bring a unique perspective to your team, you're going to start noticing that you have a lot more room to incorporate diversity onto your team, and you're going to be a lot more open to hearing what those people have to say. Which brings me into my next tip number 4, which is practice empathy. Now, this is probably the biggest tip I would say when it comes to actually physically managing your team, is approaching diversity and approaching managing diversity with a sense of empathy. Because we all, no matter what your background, no matter what your ethnicity, no matter your gender, your region that you grew up in, no matter what your strengths are, whatever your history is, we all come at work and we all come at our jobs in our own personal way. And when you're starting to look at managing other people, we bring a lot of assumptions into those, we like to impose our own sort of assumptions on those people. So when I work with people or when I manage individuals, I always like to assume that people are just as passionate or engaged with a subject matter that if I'm super interested in something, I assume that other people are always interested in it, which I can promise you is not the case. And that's fine. Like, I have my little neurotic moments where I really like doing one thing or another, but some people don't approach work that way. Some people are very not dedicated to certain things, and they'll say, I'm a generalist, I like to be a generalist, and some people like to be specialists. But if you approach work with this idea of a fixed mindset, or that you're kind of closed off or just assuming that everyone's acting the same way as you are, it's going to be really difficult for you to manage those team members. So what you want to do instead is when you immediately start working with someone, you want to make sure that you understand where they're coming from in terms of their motivation, what drives them, what's exciting to them, and then building a relationship with that individual instead of their position. Now, a lot of what managers will do is, or even if you're a head of a department, let's say you're a director or a manager or a VP, whatever your role is, you like to assume that you're building a relationship with a person, but a lot of times what people do is they build relationships with a specific position. So they'll say, oh, this position is a specialist position, therefore they must like this, they must have these sort of level of experience or expertise or education. And you kind of just assume that whoever's going to be filling that position is fitting the mold of that position. And what I will say is, there's some truth to levels of experience, levels of education, generational experience, whatever. There's some truth to that, but for the most part, every person that you put in that position is going to be very different, and they're going to approach work, and this is very important, they're going to approach work in a very different way. So when you're developing out your team or when you're building a relationship with that individual, it's important that you're building a relationship based on understanding them as a unique process and workflow as part of your larger team. So how do they like to approach work? When they are a thought processor, are they an introvert or are they an extrovert? Are they someone who likes to speak in public? Are they someone who doesn't like to have the spotlight on them? Are they someone who takes pride in the communities that they're a part of? Are they someone who likes to keep to themselves? So you kind of have to figure out from a unique relationships perspective, who are the people that you're working with? And then once you figure that out, you can leverage that diversity and their perspectives and the way that they do things and the way that they think and shine their light on things that need that attention. For example, and this is a true story, I am very extroverted. I like to think out loud. I like to work out loud. I like to have meetings. I like to talk to people. I like to kind of get things moving really quickly. I had somebody that I worked with who I admired a lot. He was very methodical, very kind of liked to take his time to think through things and was very introverted. And when he and I would work together, I tended to be the one that would talk over and kind of spit out my ideas before he had a chance to say anything. And what I found was the more that I did that, the more frustrating we both got together because I was like, why aren't you saying anything? And he was saying that I was talking over him. So we approached the situation with empathy. And so then it was a lot easier for me to take my situation and every time I was working on my team to take his expertise and say, hey, can you noodle on this for a minute and tell me what you come up with? Or hey, can you review this overnight or over the weekend and tell me what you think? And by using that perspective or using that his skill set, I was able to come up with a lot of better work that we wouldn't have otherwise had. Which takes me to my last tip. Tip number 5, prioritizing your individual strengths. Now, I talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but really this topic is kind of taking all of the things that we've talked about before, defining diversity in a unique way, incorporating it as part of your hiring experience, using empathy to build relationships. Now you're at the point where you can look at individual team members and try to figure out what their unique strengths are and then weave them together like a really cool something that's woven, a really cool blanket or a quilt or something. I don't know, pick an analogy that you want to use, but you can take everyone's unique strengths and put them together almost like puzzle pieces. There we go. Put them together like puzzle pieces and create this really cool and successful and efficient team because everyone's using their strengths in really unique ways. So we talked about some of the basic ways of doing it before, using someone strategic on an executing team, but there's a lot of different things that we can do. If someone's really good at project management, use that. If someone's really good at figuring out, if someone's a really big naysayer, they like to point out issues, give them a project and say, point out all the issues. They'll be really good at it. So kind of figure out whatever anyone's unique strength is on your team and figure out unique ways to apply that in ways that's complementing to them, but also moves your work forward. Now, so those were 5 tips about managing diverse teams. What I will say is there's so many other tips that I can give you about managing your diverse team and creating a diverse team. But really what comes down to is just having the experience and working with your team and getting to know them in a way and starting to find out where your gaps are and filling those gaps with either new people, new resources, or figuring out how to move people's workflow so that you are constantly innovating, constantly creating, and constantly incorporating outside perspectives that will move your work forward. So good luck. Let me know how it goes. Leave me a comment in the below. Tell me how you're doing with your managing your diverse team. I'd love to hear about it. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. I have new videos every Tuesday, and leave me a thumbs up if you thought this video was helpful. I will see you next week.